absolute pleasure. I think slightly overhyped in terms of expectations, but let's see if we can make keep things interesting. So my name is Ashok, and obviously I've been cooking since I was a teenager. So just to make things clear, I don't see myself as a great chef in any sense. I'm interested in cooking as in the same way I'm interested in music and other things, but I'm interested in the craft of it, right? The science and the engineering of it, and more importantly, in how knowledge of something like this, of what is essentially humanity's oldest something that centrally makes us human, the act of cooking, which other animals do not do. Um, in how that knowledge is transmitted and how we share tacit wisdom, right? And part of the reason why I wrote this book was also because I felt that there was a gap in terms of how we talked about and described cooking from this part of the world. And no argument that obviously one of the great culinary parts of the world in sheer diversity, complexity, sophistication, the use of spices, and so on. So what I will do is that I will sort of quickly share my screen and take you through a short presentation. And then, we'll have a series of questions and answers. And I sort of, I sometimes use this sort of title as a way of saying that this is not a case of, a bunch of techies in 2020 and 2021 coming and saying, hey, you know what, we've discovered the science of cooking. We can explain everything now. But really to recognize the fact that a lot of what we call food science knowledge in this part of the world is just tacit wisdom that our mothers and grandmothers have had. They've simply learnt it through oral transmission from their mothers and their grandmothers and so on. And a lot of this because of this is a part of the world that does not write down things. We have a very rich oral tradition. And, to be fair, I think women have also not had access to education for literally 2 generations ago, right? And so in that sense, a lot of this knowledge is tacit. They know exactly how to estimate water for rice. They can't quite explain the absorption rate and starch gelatinization. That's just modern science intersecting with traditional wisdom to explain something, right? Not all traditional wisdom is explainable. Not all traditional wisdom stands the test of time. With our understanding improving and so on, right? So in that sense, I always often say that your grandmother probably understood food science better than most people on the internet today, right? And the misinformation world that we live in is also a huge problem. So, so I want to start off by actually asking a very meta question about how do we learn to cook in general? We learn to draw, we learn to do other things through many ways. We learn music in many ways. We get sent to a teacher. And then we learn ourselves, right, to some extent. But you still need a basic grounding. A teacher always helps. Some very talented people can do it themselves. But for most part, you do need a teacher. Cooking, on the other hand, is interesting because on the one hand, it is a necessary skill, right? I mean, families have to eat, right? For most of history, I continue to literally outsource that to women in our family. And it's their job to figure out a balanced, nutritious meal for the entire family, take care of the old uncle with diabetes, to take care of the dietary high protein needs of young children. So all of this has to be crammed within the thought process of how we think about it. And sometimes we can't separate the culinary aspect of it from the nutritional aspect of it. And often home cooking is just a mad rush to put food on the table. And not necessarily some sort of a fine dining experience that we often have in the modern times. Yes, in the past, our grandmothers would literally sit at home and do just this. And so it's a different time, but we live in different times now. So when you think about how we learn to cook, I want to start off with a little bit of a historical context. So it's interesting to note that this is a part of the world that does not have a culture of essentially restaurants in general, of eating out. It's not a culture in this part of the world. Everywhere else, there were always inns and taverns, and you read any kind of medieval literature, there were places where you could go and eat. Not so much in this part of the world. And there's a reason for it. Historically, the traditional Hindu idea of food is that it is not something you sell. It is something that you give, right? And this has been a very strong pillar in that it literally took till the arrival of say the Mughals and the others, and then the British, for the concept of a public eating place to be common, And then there is also other reasons. There are other reasons in that, because the society is divided into castes and so on, people would not, eat with somebody from another caste, and there were all these purity rules and all that sort of stuff. So in the past, for all this while, we've never had this sort of concept, if you will, of a larger fine dining idea. Cooking was something that you did at home, and it was very clearly distinguished between what was kacha, which is anything cooked in water is considered kacha food. Anything cooked in ghee is pakka, meaning that what you cook in water is not something you can give to others, right? Obviously, there are reasons for that. Anything cooked in water will attract bacteria. All of that is there. Anything deep fried, less likely to go bad, has a longer shelf life. So that's the larger explanation. But largely thinking about it, it's essentially you had kacha food, you had pakka food, and so on. And then a whole heap of categorization of how a lot of this food depended essentially on who can make it, who can eat it, who can you give it to, and so on. Right. So this is essentially how we saw food through one lens. The second lens through which this part of the world has historically seen food is through the lens of Ayurveda and through the lens of nutrition, essentially, right? Through the lens of what is good for you, what is bad for you, what is hot, what is not, and so on, right? Obviously, we could debate on whether some of those categorizations that we came up with 2,000 years ago are still valid. Now that we understand how enzymes work, we understand how digestion works, metabolism works, and so on. And yet, at the same time, people don't realize that nutrition and metabolism is one of the least understood aspects of the human body. We understand the brain better than we understand how food and digestion and nutrition works. And so that it's still an evolving science in the sense that, you had 10 years ago, you would have people would have said, fats are bad for you. You should not eat ghee. And now, the wisdom is that, no, saturated fats are fine. Coconut oil is actually healthy. And that people who eat a diet of saturated fats seem to be healthier than people who eat unsaturated fats and so on. And sometimes, omega-3 is okay, and so on. So this science sort of constantly keeps changing. So so in that sense, we live at a time where this kind of knowledge is uniquely not complete in many senses of the world. So it's prone to misinformation. So there is that, right? That's the other aspect of how we think about learning here, is that because of our historical baggage, there is a very clear distinction, unlike in the West, between cooking at home and cooking for a restaurant. The cooking techniques are different. How you think about food is different. How you think about optimizing the kitchen is very different. And so, for example, a very tiny number of people who say learn formal catering skills in like a catering university and so on, they're so they obviously go on to become chefs and so on. But that's not the same as what you cook at home. It's very, very different. You're cooking large scale. You're thinking about consistency. You're thinking about shelf life, and you're also thinking about speed, right? You order dal makhani in a restaurant, it gets to your table in 10 minutes. Dal makhani as a dish takes 8 hours from start to finish. From urad dal to dal makhani takes 8 hours. There is just no getting around it. So how does the restaurant do it in 10 minutes is an entirely different story, right? So this is obviously not a practical, scalable way for people to really understand the science of cooking. And people in catering and who are food scientists obviously learn some of this. If you're making a Britannia biscuit or any kind of packaged food product, you literally have to understand the molecular aspects of it, because you want to make sure that it does not kill anyone who eats it, that you don't get into a lawsuit, and that it tastes exactly the same, no matter which factory you produce it from, right? So there is that, right? The other thing, obviously, people do is to learn from their grandmothers and mothers. People learn cooking naturally in almost like an apprenticeship mode. Typically, if you're a daughter, you're definitely going to pick this knowledge up. They will call you when you're 12 or 13 years old to help you chop vegetables first, then kind of make the simple dishes, and then that's how you sort of learn these skills, right? Unfortunately, in this part of the world, not enough sons and not enough men learn this skill. Something that we need to fix. But this is one. But now, increasingly, what has happened is that the rise of the nuclear family in the context of India has also meant that not enough young people today have access to be mentored on a daily basis by grandparents. Grandparents and parents increasingly do not live together in nuclear families in urban settings and so on. So clearly, this is also an increasingly diminishing way in which you learn to improve what you do, right? To improve cooking and so on, right? So therein comes the internet, right? So the internet really just stepped in the mid 90s, and now literally everyone today watches either TV or the internet to pick up new recipes. So the first place you go for recipes is YouTube, right? You scroll through Instagram, you find someone interesting, and you say, "Oh, I'm going to bookmark this recipe and try it out," right? And so this growth of the internet as a source of of largely a lot of our culinary knowledge today, and cookbooks and so on, is essentially where we are today, right? Now, obviously, I think there is a certain aspect to the internet that I want to talk about, right? There's an interesting phenomenon. So it turns out that in two interesting stories that I'll tell you. One is in Korea, one happened elsewhere, right? Uh, Instagram as a visual social medium is very addictive. I mean, it's people just like scrolling through interesting, cool looking things, and the visual medium tends to it tends to algorithmically promote certain kinds of things over other things, right? And not all food looks delicious. So there's a distinction between tasting delicious and looking delicious. Looking delicious is a purely visual sense, and not everything looks great. Khichdi doesn't look great, but certain kinds of dishes look really nice and in Instagram. The key apparently is that the less you cook it, the more undercooked it is, it looks better on Instagram. So the more cooked it is, more mushy it is, it doesn't look good on Instagram. And so there's a tendency for people to be inspired by the visual metaphor of Instagram and undercook their food, purely for the sake of Instagram and purely for the sake of social media. And this is true for YouTube as well, right? So you put out a cookery video, the ones that actually feature slightly undercooked dishes tend to do better statistically than ones that are completely cooked, and so on, right? So this is a fascinating phenomenon. Likewise, apparently, another simple, for those of you interested in science, uh, there was a phenomenon observed in Korea where there was a drastic increase amongst young women to get plastic surgery on their noses, right? To reduce the size of their noses, because all of a sudden, ever since Instagram arrived, uh, uh, plastic surgeries on noses have increased, which is a very bizarre correlation, right? Now, apparently, it turns out that it is because of selfie cameras, right? So before cameras, if you had to take a photo of yourself, somebody had to take it of you. So the smartphone and the selfie camera was the first time that allowed you to photograph yourself pretty conveniently. Only one problem: the length of our arms is typically within the focal length of your eye. So what that does is that because of the nature of which under that focal length, it has this effect where your nose actually looks bigger than the rest of your face, because the distance from the tip of your nose is smaller than that, and that difference, the ratio, is large enough to the point where your noses look bigger in a selfie versus from a camera placed 10 feet away, right? Which is what professional photographers tend to do. They take it from slightly farther away and so on, right? And because people are taking selfies, a lot more people felt that their noses were too big and they were actually getting plastic surgery. So again, what I'm trying to say is that the internet, for all its fantastic, amazing source of knowledge and so on, has a lot of unseen effects in terms of how in society, right? And this is just one of them. And definitely in food, in the context of food, this idea that sometimes ugly looking food is delicious, more nutritious food, is something that we sometimes seem to be losing. And that's not just it, right? So the internet also tends to algorithmically optimize for popularity as opposed to veracity, right? And so what happens is that the best recipes are not what float up to the first of your search results. The most popular recipes do. And popularity is determined by search engine optimization. It's not determined by the quality of your content, increasingly, in terms of how this entire world works, because of the sheer number of choices that are available, right? And the other thing is that a lot of food writing in this part of the world is recipe centric. And I have an entire theory of why Indian cooking must not be taught in terms of recipes, but more in terms of algorithms, because that's how our grandmothers thought about it. And we'll kind of get to that, right? If you think about the fact that most people, when you cook at home, you make do with what you have. You look at your fridge, you see what you have, and you figure out what dish you're going to make with those ingredients, with whatever you have. It's not like you're going to weigh 400 grams or 200 grams of something else and 9 grams of salt or something like that. So it is almost always going to be, there's always an andaza, or this sort of rule of thumb or rough sort of sense, heuristic, that people use, that you cook. People don't cook by using recipes. This is not to say there are not good recipes. There are recipes that tend to give you heuristics, but not always. Most recipes do not, right? And we'll kind of see some examples as well. Recipes themselves also are another problem, which is that, this is other story that I often like to say, that sometimes people have, like, I have one son. The moment people have like one child, they immediately think themselves as being expert parents. in that they can advise other people who do not have children yet, right? You literally have one anecdotal example and that's it, and you don't really have an experience. You're not like a school teacher or a daycare center person who actually has experience with multiple children. But no, one children and people think they are experts. And in some sense, what happens with recipes also is the sense that you will tend to people tend to cook it once and they feel it came out well, and then they then estimate what they did. Nobody's actually sitting and weighing every ingredient on a weighing machine. uh, People tend to cook using andaza, and then they attempt to write recipes with great precision, right? So it's a simple scientific principle. You start with something that's approximate, and then you're trying to write something precise. What you're getting is not precision, right? So what you're getting is the illusion of precision. And so in some sense, I think that's something to be thought about. The second thing is that a lot of food in this part of the world has what I call an authenticity bias, right? Authenticity bias is that everybody seems to be obsessed of making, I need to make an authentic Bengali biryani. I need to make an authentic, Tamil sambar and all of that. Let's take Tamil Nadu sambar, okay? The tur dal did not arrive in the south till the Marathas bought it with them. The local legume used in traditionally is moong dal, right? Pongal has moong dal. The harvest festival actually uses moong dal. Tur dal came much later. The Marathas bought tur dal with them when they conquered Tanjore and sort of set up their kingdom there. Number two, tomatoes didn't arrive in India till the Portuguese introduced them. We did not have tomatoes. We did not have chilies. And sambar powder is literally, there is no sambar without tomatoes, chilies, and so on, right? Coriander was bought by apparently Alexander's troops when from the Mediterranean, introduced when he came. Yes, 2,000 years old, so you can give it some credit. So literally, when you think about it, there are no truly native spices used other than turmeric in sambar. Okay? Everything else is foreign. The vegetables you use, carrot, beans, introduced by the British. In Tamil Nadu, they're actually called English vegetables because they were introduced by the British, right? The traditional vegetables increasingly are not used. People use the vegetables, cabbage and carrot and beans, all were introduced by the Europeans. And since they would grow in the warmer climates of India, they would grow them in the hill stations, right? Uti and the Western Ghats is where some of these vegetables would grow because the climate was a lot more similar and so on, right? And chilies is the greatest example. Indian food globally is defined by chilies. And we did not have chilies more than 400 years ago. And it didn't become really universally popular till 17th century or so, right? Recipes before that tended to use black pepper or long pepper, pippali, right? So the problem here is that often what a lot of recipe writers tend to ignore is that there is no such thing called authenticity in food. It is just a completely fraudulent idea. There is no, every recipe is as authentic as the home that it comes from. And every family does its own thing. No two families make sambar the same way. No two families make biryani the same way. No two families make the same dish the same way, right? And yet we somehow want to create this illusion that there is an authenticity, etc. Bengali biryani, Kolkata biryani, it must not be messed with. The potatoes were introduced by the Portuguese. There were no potatoes in Bengal. And yet potatoes in biryani is considered to be a traditional thing in Bengal, right? And so often I think in the context of food, a lot of history is much shorter than we think it is because food constantly changes, right? So a lot of how we think about recipes is to say that this is not authentic unless you use these 20 ingredients is a completely bogus idea. Right? So therefore, I think that's a wrong way to think about cooking in general. So that's number one, right? And the other problem obviously is that there's a universe of nutritional pseudoscience. We've all seen what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic itself. Apparently the sales of turmeric just went through the roof. Not because people were using it in cooking. People were like dropping turmeric into water and drinking it. Okay. Strange thing. There was a doctor who spoke about this on Twitter, a doctor in Mumbai, a surgeon in Mumbai, who shared this interesting story saying that they'd scheduled surgery for someone. And the normally for a surgery, and if you were doctors will know that you have to go through a checklist. The patient has to do this, you do this, you make sure you do not do this, you do not eat this, etc., etc. And you come here. So there's a checklist of things that they have to ask so that the patient is not doing something silly before they come to the surgery and so on. And their protocol did not have this list called is the person drinking turmeric water 3 times a day, because it's not something they expected people to do. But in the COVID-19 pandemic, apparently people were drinking turmeric water 3 times a day, and it's a blood thinner. It's good for you in small quantities, but turmeric is a blood thinner. If you eat it in large quantities, it will thin your blood and prevent it from clotting. Imagine if you're a surgeon, you're trying to cut open someone, you want the blood to clot. And if the blood doesn't clot, you have a serious problem and the patient could die, right? And so literally what happens is that the way we process nutritional pseudoscience is, and combine it with cooking, and that if you use this ingredient is healthier, without any attention to, for example, the actual ratio and proportion of the item. Classic example, Himalayan pink salt. Everybody is now using Himalayan pink salt because it apparently has 84 minerals. That's the marketing spiel, right? Uh, a simple somebody with any high school sort of science education and knowledge should first ask the question: those other 84 minerals, what is their proportion compared to sodium chloride in that salt? And the answer is less than 0.5% or something like that. Okay? So already in a dish, you're going to use maximum 1 or 2% salt. Okay. So you're using maybe like 2 or 3 grams of salt in your food. In that, imagine 1/100th of that proportion is what you have some of these trace minerals. When that is diluted in a dish that is 700 grams by weight, you are not getting enough for it to make any kind of impact at all, right? So they say, there's this sort of saying in toxicology, the other end of the spectrum, that well, nothing is a poison or everything is a poison. It's the dosage that matters. Okay? It's the same thing with nutrition. It's the percentage dosage that matters. Right? If you're literally getting like a few molecules, it's not actually going to make any difference, right? So those 84 trace minerals are present in such small quantities that it makes no difference, right? Other fun fact, of course, it's marketed as Himalayan pink salt because marketing it as Pakistani pink salt in India will not work. All pink salt in the world comes from one mine in Punjab in Pakistan, right? And actually, all manufacturers in India buy it from from some distributors who send it through China and bring it here and so on. But all pink salt comes from one mine. There is no other place in the world from where you get pink salt. So this is sort of the point here I'm trying to make, is that it's hard for people to sort of make sense of a lot of this. So therefore I realized that you should have a set of very simple, no nonsense rules that let you challenge a lot of the misinformation that you see, right? And for most part, when it comes to cooking and taste, it's one thing. But when it comes to nutrition, always trust an expert. Do not trust what you see on WhatsApp and so on. So, which kind of brings me to part of the reason why I really wrote this book, which is that when you think about good recipes is what I call in computer science, they're called models, right? Models in the sense that they give you a template from which you can instantiate an actual dish many times, and you can do it consistently, right? So every time you do it, it will relatively taste, pretty much the same. So that's the principle of a good recipe, right? But unfortunately, most ways of documenting Indian cuisine don't explain the why. Right? I'll show you some examples of that in the subsequent one, right? So this thing is that there's a lot of history for why we tend to consider cooking to be an art and not a craft. Part of that history obviously has to do with the elephant in the room, which is that we've outsourced this to women in our family. Hey, it is art, right? So it is not craft. I will not attempt to make it easier. I will not attempt to document it. I will not attempt to use modern technology. My grandfather would tell my grandmother that the chutney made for idli must not be made in a mixie, in a blender, but made in a mortar and pestle because it's tastier, right? Technically, yes, he's right. Okay, and there are science reasons for that, but it's just more work for women, right? At the end of the day. So for most part, it's a question of a constant battle between what will I do to make my life easier in the kitchen, right? Is it okay to use a microwave? Is it okay to use a blender? Is it okay to use a food processor? Gas flame, there are still people who will swear by food cooked on wood fire is tastier. There are reasons why it is tastier. But yes, but the person cooking over a wood fire will die at the age of 45 from a bad lung. That's an entirely separate issue altogether, right? So the idea of what is art and what is craft is very important in the context of cooking. A fine dining chef in a 5-star restaurant putting out a fantastic new dish, that is art. Cooking daily at home to feed your family, that should be craft. It should not be art. Craft requires better documentation. Craft requires the ability for a beginner to take something up and learn it, right? And I, as someone who's also a musician, and I have learned Indian classical music for almost 20 years. Then I've also learned Western classical music when I was in the US. One thing that struck me is that how you train for Indian classical music is not great. let's say it's not great in the sense that it ultimately reduces people who are interested in it, leaving behind a tiny number of eventual practitioners. Whereas the world of the craft of Western music gives you a basic level of training, not all of whom go on to become Western classical musicians. Most of them go on to become pop musicians, film musicians, and a whole universe of other things, because the foundational nature of how the craft is documented is significantly better, right? Let's not get, don't get me wrong here. The art of Indian classical music and the art of Western classical music are all amazing in their own right. But I think the craft is what I'm talking about. Is craft is fundamentally engineering. Craft is fundamentally how you document something, how you train something, how do you get the basics right to someone. And this is a space where we've generally lacked, both in the context of music and also in the context of food as well, right? So to highlight the distinction between model, a good model and a bad model. Okay, this is from a recipe for dal makhani. Literally, I think the first or second result on Google. Okay, depending on where you are and so on, right? And it's so clearly it is seen by millions and millions of people. Every time they search for dal makhani, this is going to come up. A lot of people are going to see it, right? As a recipe, it's not bad at all. It's perfectly fine, and it'll work. And you do it, you'll get a pretty good dal makhani. Okay. Now, just see point number 8 and point number 9, right? On the face of it, the first time you read it, you might think, oh, fine, makes sense. I mean, they've asked me to do it, so I'll do it, right? And I probably get a creamier, thicker dal and so on. But the reality is that the reasons given are not correct. Okay. Number 8 is, and it might seem very pedantic, but I'll explain why this is a problem in the longer run. Step number 8 says boil for 15 minutes till the dal absorbs flavor and turns thick. Okay. Two problems with this. Dal does not absorb anything other than salt. Actually, anything you cook absorbs only salt. Salt is the only molecule that is capable of penetrating inside anything that you eat, right? Any other spice molecules, all the other flavors, they're all too large, too complex. And trust me, simple rule of thumb, if they could penetrate cells as easily as salt, then we'd not be in trouble. We'd not be alive, right? So, the COVID-19 virus has to use a ACE, that spike protein to open and get into a cell. That's how hard it is. And if you think your cumin and coriander can simply get into cells, you'd be kidding yourself, right? So therefore, so always remember this: flavors do not penetrate inside. You do get the illusion. I can understand why it's natural to think so, because when you eat something, it feels as if the flavors are coming from the inside. They're not. They're actually coming from the outside. But because you're gnashing with your mouth, you have a feeling that it's coming from inside. And if it's really well spiced, the feeling is more intense, and you sort of think the flavors have actually gotten inside. They don't. Only salt is the only flavor that gets inside meat or inside any plant, right? So that's number 1. So flavors do not go inside. That's number 1. Only salt goes inside. And by the way, that is not the reason why it turns thick. Thickness is a function of 2 things. Thickness is a function of whether the starches have gotten cooked, so they become thick when they absorb water. So from being powdery in the original state, they become almost like a gel. So that's why it gives you the illusion of thickness, right? Thickness is also an illusion that you get when something is an emulsion. Emulsion essentially is, when you mix fat and water, 2 things that don't mix, you somehow get them to mix using an intermediary, either through agitation or through a molecule that has a water-loving end and a fat-loving end. So that's called an emulsifying agent, right? So that's the only way you think of thickness. So starch in general is a thickener, because it absorbs, it becomes thick by itself, and it makes the overall liquid thick as well, right? So here's what. So that's number 8. But on the face of it, most people just read it. They probably just pay attention to the fact that you have to boil it for 15 minutes, right? But with the fact that you've got all the other reasons wrong, essentially means that this bit of knowledge, as it gets transmitted, right, in some other context somewhere, people will think that I can infuse more flavor into the dal by adding more spice and then boiling it for 15 minutes or anything else, right? And it won't work, right? So, and the point, that's the problem with not using science to describe the why in a reasonably accurate fashion. And the part of the problem of how you document recipes is that you often give the wrong reasons, right? Now, so there are two situations here. There are the kinds of reasoning. The reasoning is wrong, but the outcome will just be right. And I'll give the example in the context of pressure cooking later, right? The other example is that the reasoning is wrong and your outcome will not be the same. in another context. It'll work only in this context, but somehow the reasoning makes it seem that it is actually a general rule and so on. Right? So this is one other problem. Uh, the point number 9 is also quite interesting. It says to get the creamy texture, add fresh cream. This again is again entirely unnecessary, right? The creamy texture of dal makhani, and if you look at how the Punjabis do it, comes from the dal itself. It does not come from the cream that you add. The creaminess comes because as the starch gelatinizes, it takes on a really, really creamy texture. That's why your Punjabi grandmothers will actually take a sort of this thing and squeeze the dal as it gets completely cooked to gelatinize, to really mix a lot of that cooked the dal into the gravy itself, and that gives the creamy texture. So in fact, what they will tell you is that you don't need to add a ton of cream to make it creamy. You can get the creaminess simply by slow cooking it. Right? And in Punjab, you'll often cook this. Urad dal is one of those things you can cook for 10 hours and the taste will improve. Okay. So unlike other things, right? So they will literally just put some coals and slow fire and let the dal cook overnight. In fact, what they often do is that they switch off the tandoor and there is still residual heat and they'll just put a pot of dal there. The next day morning, you will have the creamiest dal you can imagine. You don't need any other, you don't need cream, you don't need butter. The makhani part of this is not the fact that you have to add tons of makhan. The makhani part of it is that the creamy nature of the dal itself is why it's called that, and so on, right? So again, so the part of the reason here is really paying a lot more attention to the why what you do results in the outcome that you want, and also being clear about why it works in this context versus why it may not work in that context, in another context. And 3, there are situations where it may not be replicatable at all, right? So that's in some sense my problem with a lot of the ways in which we write about recipes, and this is, by the way, one of the better ones, right? And so one of my approaches to thinking about recipes in this context is, rather than have a sequence of steps, right? I want to look at a recipe visually as a set of layers, as a set of optional layers, and each layer, you feel free to experiment in each of these layers independently, and some layers are optional entirely. So if you look at a dish visually, at the bottom there's a flavor base, right? You mix oil and butter, you grate onions till it's browned, and the book actually talks about the stage 1 through 4 browning of onion. So that's what I meant by stage 4 browning. Ginger garlic paste, tomato puree, and if you don't want to use ginger garlic paste, use only ginger, for religious reasons and so on. Tomato puree plus tomato paste, because just tomatoes are simply not consistently sour enough from a taste standpoint. So always use a mix, and use things like, say, Kashmiri chili powder, turmeric, and so on. So that's your flavor base, right? Then there's an optional layer, which I obviously borrow from Western cooking, is that adding a little bit of alcohol actually improves the flavor. The alcohol mostly burns off, but it actually extracts a lot more flavor from the spices before it does. And that it almost always improves a lot of your dishes. So if you don't have a religious problem with it, I think you should go ahead and use like a tablespoon or a teaspoon of brandy or rum or any cheap liquor that you have. It will really, really improve a lot of the dishes that you make, because alcohol dissolves spice flavors better than water does, and so that's part of the reason. Then you have a base gravy itself, and then your prepped main ingredients, the stock itself, which you could use dal stock or just water, plain water. The seasoning, the balance of salt and sweet, and then all the finishing flavors. It could be smoking, it could be finishing spices. You could adjust intensity. Let's say that, it turns out to be too intense, too spicy, add some cream and butter. That's when you should add cream and butter, right? And if it's not intense enough, you can add what I call garam masala flavored butter. So that's another way of really amping up the flavor and so on. I want the smoky flavor. Okay. So the way I look at a recipe is this way, which is to say that it must give me a set of paths that I can take with many options, with things I could do, and also ways in which I can adjust the flavor one way or another, rather than a linear set of steps. That's not how we think of cooking. Visually, when you're thinking of cooking, you're looking at a pot and you're layering flavors. That's how you think of it. So my thought process was that, you know what, I want food writers, and since I'm not the expert cook, I want food writers to perhaps consider using a template like this to write recipes. There are already some food science books in the West that already do this. Modernist Cuisine is a famous example. In fact, they also, incidentally, don't use actual weights. They don't literally only say 400 grams or 100 grams. They use ratios. So what they say is that what is your largest ingredient? Let's say rice, ratio of 1, right? Dal, ratio of say 50%, right? So 0.5. And then salt is 0.02, and so on. So obviously, it's possible that we may not all have like weight scales and so on, but actually it gives you a visual sense of how much to use rather than precise this thing. So I can roughly estimate half of rice is dal versus, think in ratios rather than absolute amounts, right? So that's one. Now, to go one step further, uh, my book also sort of recommends that in your head, at least, rather than remember models for recipes, remember a meta model. Why only a model for dal makhani, right? When I could just generalize that into any North Indian gravy, any Punjabi gravy, right? I have a flavor base, use whatever you want. I have all of these things. If the prepped ingredients, if it is legumes or dal, you pressure cook it ahead of time. If it's vegetables, par cook and saute in oil before adding it. If it's meat, brine and marinate before adding it. All the rest of the process basically just remains the same. The stock could be water, it could be vegetable stock, meat stock, seafood stock, or diluted coconut milk, or whatever it is, right? The acid could be from amchur, tamarind, anything that adds sourness could come from amchur, tamarind, vinegar, if the tomatoes are not sour enough, right? And then finishing flavors, all the same options exist. And this thing, so you could generate 1,000 recipes in your head by looking at the meta model, right? So that in some sense is what I wanted to also set out to do, because uh, individual recipes themselves are a very limiting and inefficient way to capture culinary wisdom in a generic sense. And this more represents the way our mothers and grandmothers have thought about cooking historically. And this is a more faithful representation of how they think about cooking itself. So this is one, right? Now, so what I want to do is that in the larger sense of how we think about cooking, right? So there is this idea of verified knowledge, unverified knowledge, and then there is unwritten knowledge and written knowledge. So two spectrum, right? So as any IT or techie or consulting guy, you need to have a 2x2 matrix to describe these things. So on the one hand, there is the bottom left, verified, written, published science, right? So not all of it is always verified and so on, but for most part, it is relatively the most trustable knowledge in society tends to be published science, right? Which is because it's peer reviewed, it's tested, other people can challenge. There's an incentive structure to challenge someone else's work, and so on, right? So there is that, right? Then there's popular science, which is the sort of thing that I am attempting to do, which is that I'm not looking to write a white paper because those are very hard to read. But can I simplify it to the point and just give you what you need in order to be better informed, right? So that's popular science, right? The internet is essentially all over. There is stuff that is verified, but there is also the full spectrum of things that are completely unverified, right? Then you have essentially your social media ecosystem, which is just largely unverified. It's just, you can, because the algorithms tend to promote sensationalism, the chances are that useful stuff rarely gets amplified. So there is that, right? And then you have unwritten, unverified stuff, which is gossip and word of mouth and so on. So less I said about that, the better. And then there is tacit wisdom. It's unwritten, but it's true. It works. It's in the heads of people who are experts, right? It's in the head of the farmer who knows exactly when to harvest the rice, or exactly when water needs to be put, or exactly when fertilizer needs to be applied, or when to harvest the fruit and so on. It's in the head of people who cook. It's in the head of people who know exactly what is lacking in this dish and how to balance it before I finish it, and so on, right? So the intent of Masala Lab is to take the context of tacit wisdom in cooking and bring that into this quadrant as much as possible. Wherever applicable, wherever testable, wherever the idea is to take that wisdom, test it out, and see if it works, right? Most things work, few things don't work, right? One example of things that don't work: when you cut a cucumber, they'll say that you chop the ends of the cucumber, and if you rub it, it will reduce the bitterness. No amount of tiny rubbing will change the fundamental biochemical nature of that entire cucumber to render it less bitter. It's not going to work. But on the other hand, how you estimate water for rice will work. How you hydrate dough to make the flakiest or the softest parathas is a technique that will work. And many of these things, except that they don't understand gluten structures and fat shortening and all of those other principles, but it's still wisdom that largely works, right? So now what I want to do is to kind of give you a little bit of a sense of some of the things in the book, some excerpts and also some excerpts from other food science columns and other things that I have written to give you some practical examples of the kinds of things that I'm talking about. And so to obviously, so whet your appetite so that you'll go out and buy the book and so on, right? And so I also illustrated the book. So the book has, these illustrations slightly, all the humor in the book is sort of restricted to the pictures because the Penguin editor said, don't use too much humor because it puts people off. So keep it, matter of fact, a little bit of humor, but pictures you can go wild, right? So the intent of this diagram is to say that how you cut your garlic has an impact on its flavor, because the flavor of garlic actually comes from sulfurous flavor molecules and some enzymatic reactions that get kicked off the moment you chop into it. The moment you start damaging cells in the garlic, that enzyme reaction starts, right? And so the more cells you damage, the more stronger flavors you get. Now, it's a question of understanding what flavors you actually want in your dish, right? So if you want a very mild garlic flavor, you want to use pretty much the whole garlic pot. If you want a little bit more medium flavor, you want to slice it. If you want stronger flavor, you want to mince it. And if you want the strongest flavor, you blend the whole thing, right? Ginger garlic paste or garlic paste is the strongest garlic flavor that you can get out of this cup. So this is, again, the intent of this actually is part of a chapter that basically seeks to talk about how the very act of preparing and cutting is when cooking begins, right? Uh, all living things, plants, whatever it is. So the moment you start chopping them, reactions start to happen. Enzymatic reactions are kicked off. Oxidation starts to happen. A whole bunch of things happen. So cooking literally starts then. So you have to understand that a fair bunch of impact of flavor comes literally in how you cut. Even your vegetables, how you choose to cut it will determine the amount of surface area it has. More the surface area, you have more opportunities for crisping, more opportunities for flavor to get attached and so on. Lesser the surface area, milder the taste and so on. So these are all general principles that anyone can sort of remember and apply it in a universal sort of sense. This probably looks slightly more complicated, but it's part of a chapter that talks about food's most important chemical reaction, the Maillard reaction, right? Literally anything that goes brown when you cook it is probably the Maillard reaction, right? What happens at temperatures above 110 Celsius, which means that this is a reaction that happens only after all surface water is boiled off. Because as long as there is water, which is, you see those molecules of water walking away, right? As long as there's water around, you can't have this reaction. So which is why only when you deep fry or saute something dry, only then you get this sort of brown color. Anything you cook in water is never going to take on that brown color because the temperature will always be less than 100. And this needs 110 Celsius for that reaction to start, right? So sugars and amino acids in food combine to produce a range of flavors and smells and aromas. So that literally distinguish between your raw onion and browned onion, raw cabbage, steamed cabbage, and really caramelized brown cabbage. You didn't take anything. So, a steamed potato versus a deep fried golden brown potato. All of these are examples of the Maillard reaction that has happened. Tons of more flavor. And so again, the point here is that if you're making any dish, if you want more flavor, saute the vegetables separately and then add them to the gravy. Anything you cook in a gravy is not going to take on these flavors. So get those flavors ahead of time and then add them in. So that's why, you can oven roast vegetables before adding them in. Restaurants almost always do that for speed as well, right? So your aloo gobi in a restaurant is literally deep fried aloo and gobi dropped into a red gravy, which was made separately. And that's why you get the dish in under 5-10 minutes, right? So this is, which is also why a hotel aloo gobi tastes more intense than the aloo gobi you're able to make at home, right? For instance, right? And so these are all the family of molecules, some of the families of molecules that yield specific aromas, right? And also remember that what we say taste is mostly smell. 80% of what we perceive as flavor is smell. So which is why when you have a cold or have anosmia from COVID, you won't enjoy food because you can't smell it. Taste is only the 5 things: bitter, salt, umami, sourness, and sweetness, right? But flavors, aroma is very, very multidimensional. We can smell upwards of 10,000 different flavor molecules. So it's important to remember that the aroma of cardamom is fantastic and complex. The taste of cardamom is just bitter, right? So if you have a cold, cardamom will actually just taste bitter, nothing else. Right? So The other, so the other sorts of things that I kind of talk about clearly, I also write some columns for Mint, where I often raise these, humorous, nothing serious sort of these things about why is egg non-vegetarian, whereas why is milk vegetarian? So in that sense, so it's just to say that these are arbitrary distinctions that we make. There's cultural baggage to it, but really there's no scientific baggage to it. Right? And I often find that people think that if you leave an egg alone, it will hatch into a chick. It's sort of, the state of biology education even in urban India, I guess it leaves a lot to be desired. But people don't realize that the egg is literally the unfertilized egg. The egg that you eat is unfertilized, right? It is, as I said, egg is what you get when you prevent a hen from getting pregnant. Okay, milk is what you get after you force a cow to be pregnant. So the pure play ethics and morality of that is from a pure fun standpoint, is there's no reason why eggs should be red and red dot, and milk should be green dot. Anyway, so on a lighter note, but there's also a chapter on eggs in the book that obviously talk about how versatile it is, and also more importantly how you can get every texture you possibly can with an egg, right? How you can make sure so the yolk and the whites actually cook at different temperatures, which is part of what makes cooking an egg slightly tricky. You can always hard boil it and you're fine, and the yolk will be powdery, and the whites will be really really hard and chewy. But if you like soft boiled eggs, if you want your yolk to be just not liquid but just sort of slightly flowing, etc., you have to understand temperatures. You have to understand what happens at 62, what happens at 65 Celsius, and it's in a matter of 2 or 3 Celsius that it happens, and why you need to take your eggs and put them in an ice bath so that you stop cooking, so that you lock in the amount of cooking. Otherwise, the egg will continue to cook after you take it out of the water, and so on. And also why, for instance, if you add salt to egg 15 minutes ahead of making an omelette, it will turn out to be beautifully soft, right? The reason for that is that salt actually uncoils proteins, the complex proteins. Proteins have three-dimensional structures. Salt will tend to uncoil them, right? And because you're uncoiling them ahead of time, when you cook the egg takes a lot more time for those proteins to set again into something harder, coagulate, right? Get harder and so on. So what that does is that it results in an omelette that is much softer. Whereas regular unsalted egg, when you make an omelette, the proteins will coagulate really rapidly and you get a really chewy, harder omelette. So if you want that melt in the mouth texture of omelette while still being fully cooked, you want to salt your omelette 15 minutes ahead of time. Likewise, when you're making scrambled eggs, use cold butter as opposed to hot butter. Because what cold butter does is that the fats actually prevent the proteins from coiling back really fast. And because you're using cold butter, the butter takes a lot more time and the heat is distributed more evenly as the butter melts, as opposed to already melted butter, which will get sort of absorbed very quickly and so on. Right? So these are all some of the sort of food science tricks that you kind of learn in day-to-day things that could really just improve, or something as basic as an omelette and so on. Right? So this is as I do these illustrations for Mint, which you can follow on Instagram as well as Twitter, to sort of see how we how best to boil eggs, or how to best to make an omelette and so on. And also I think the interesting chapter on my favorite ingredient, obviously chilies, right? The fascinating aspect of how a chili creates the effect that it does. Why do we get that sensation of heat? And what does it actually do? It's remarkable because chilies have that family of plants has evolved a molecule called capsaicin, a family of molecules called capsaicinoids, right? And they're amazing, right? So our tongue actually has, in addition to taste buds and other things, it has nerve endings. It has these receptors to also make sure you don't do other stupid things, like eat really hot food, by temperature wise hot, right? Because if you put something burning hot, it will burn your mouth and you run the risk of doing serious damage to your insides. So your mouth has a vested interest in preventing you from eating anything that's above a certain temperature, right? In terms of pure temperature, right? So these heat sensors are called TRPV1 receptors. Their job is to detect food that is hot in temperature. What this receptor happens to do, what capsaicin happens to do, is that that molecule seems to be able to turn on this receptor even at normal room temperature. Doesn't have to be hot, right? So that's the magic here. So what it does is that because it's able to turn that on, your tongue is sending a message to your brain, this person is eating something hot, as in temperature wise hot. Okay. I can see why we use the confusion, because we literally use the word hot to describe the sensation, because that's exactly what's happening. It fools the brain into thinking that you are eating something high temperature. So let's take some, damage control. Let's make you sweat more. So you cool the body down. A lot more blood circulation to the face is increased. So you get red when you eat something really, really hot and spicy. And then what happens is that because the body thinks that you're going to be in pain, it will release some endorphins, so that the body has this sort of a brain system, right? So every time there is pain, it will give you a little bit of pleasure. So it helps you deal with the pain. So that is essentially how our reward system works. So eating chilies, the brain's reward system kicks into mind, so it gives pleasure. So which then improves the experience of eating food, which is why we are addicted to hot and spicy food, right? Despite it being a painful experience, we love that sensation. And this is literally this molecule doing this sort of bit of magic. And again, depending on what variety of chili it is, some have lots of capsaicin, some have a smaller amount of capsaicin, and so on. So your Bhoot Jolokia, ghost chili from the Naga chilies have a ton of capsaicin. So they're really, really, really hot. And on the other end of the spectrum, your Shimla mirch or your typical capsicum bell pepper has no capsaicin. So it's the same plant, literally the same species, but you see the variation that one has no heat and one has, all the heat. That's the power of artificial selection, right? And then, so as I said, the brain dispatches more blood to your face, and to lower the temperature, and it gives you the sort of endorphin high, so that you feel. So that's why eating spicy food is pleasurable. It makes the food taste better to you, right? And that's the other thing. So again, as I said, the book itself is structured as really foundational basics, right? In terms of heat sources, pressure cooking, water, cooking rice, cooking dal, cooking wheat, vegetables, meat, eggs, fat, right? And then adding flavor, right? How do you deal with taste? How do you deal with aroma? How do you deal with mouthfeel? What's the distinction between crispy food and not crispy food, right? I'll give you a fantastic sort of science anecdote. Uh, Potato chips taste better in first class part of an airplane than they do in the economy class of an airplane. If you're wondering why, uh, it turns out that our perception of our ability of our tongue to taste a lot of these flavors is not great at the temperature and pressure and dry humidity of the economy of a plane in general, which is why most foods do not taste good in a plane. So it's actually not that the food is bad, it's just that your taste sense is bad on a plane. So just that's number one, right? uh, the other part of, particularly when it comes to a potato chip, is that the single biggest component of the flavor perception of a potato chip is the crunch. It's not the taste, right? It can be anything. If it does not have the crunch, you'll say it's a bad chip, right? If it does not have a satisfying crunch sound, right? So the crispiness is a very important part of that. And because there is so much ambient noise, white noise in the economy class of a plane, uh, you are not going to hear that crunch loud enough internally for you to think it's tasty. So this is the fascinating thing. However, in first class or business class, airplanes will give you, noise cancelling headphones, especially on long international flights. And noise cancelling headphones will help you taste the thing better, because you can hear the crunch a lot better. And this is, by the way, also why, because the ambient noise is a lot less, people perceive the exact same dish in the business class as being better, although you're literally being served pretty much the same food, except better presented, right? And so this is so lots of these sorts of fascinating insights about how flavor itself comes about. Another interesting story is about why does organic produce, certain kinds of organic produce, not all, some organic vegetables and so on, taste better than their non-organic counterparts, right? Why is that, right? Uh, the fun reason behind that has to be that what we consider to be flavor in a vegetable comes from defensive chemicals that the plant generates in order to fight off predators, insects and bugs and fungi and bacteria and so on. So the more at risk a plant is of external infection and invaders and preys and insects and butterflies and all those other things, the tastier it will be, because it will generate more of those defensive chemicals, and it's those defensive chemicals that insects hate that we like as flavor, right? So a tastier tomato is essentially one that has produced more defensive chemicals to ward off pests. So that's basically the foundational reason. And non-organic produce uses so much pesticide and others that they grow in sterile environments where there are no prey, no predators at all, right? Whereas organic produce has to fight. That's why the size is smaller, and the yield is not as much, but they end up being tastier because they produce a lot more of these flavor molecules to fight off these insects. And this fun fact that you can actually trick, so some organic growers in some parts of the world, you can trick the plant into thinking it's under attack, although there are no pests around, by using crustacean shell powder, right? So shrimps, which we eat otherwise, and we throw away the shells. Shrimps are closely related to insects, so they also have chitin in their shells and so on. And so plants detect the presence of this molecule called chitin in order to sense insect threats, right? So you can fool the plant into thinking that it is under threat by powdering crustacean shells, crab shells, shrimp shells, and so on, and adding it to the soil. And the plant will think it's under danger, and it'll produce a fruit that is much tastier, and so on, right? So these are just some of the more fascinating things that you can learn. Then there's a chapter on browning onions, garlic, potatoes, Maillard reaction, the art of deep frying, and so on. Then acids, right? Use of tamarind, vinegar, citrus, yogurt, all of these things that add sourness to food, very central to Indian cooking. And newer techniques, use of umami, use of baking soda, the use of alcohol, use of microwaves, and so on. And then these algorithms for gravies, rice dishes, breads, chutneys. And then, obviously the last chapter is essentially how can we put all this together in what is essentially turning out to be sort of like the quintessential pan-Indian dish in terms of popularity, which is biryani, right? And so I'll sort of end with three sort of common myths that we cover in the book, and then we'll do Q&A, right? So the first one is that pressure cooking is measured in whistles. This is an example of the category of knowledge that I spoke about, where the heuristic works, but it works in a very limited fashion, right? It does not work generally, and so this is an example of a why reasoning that is okay for the limited context and mostly okay in that context, but does not work as a general way. The reason being is that a lot of people fundamentally misunderstand how pressure cooking works, because they think that, hey, every time I just have to, the whistle frequency at which the whistles come is how I measure cooking, right? But that's not how whistles actually work, right? What happens is that a pressure cooker works by increasing the pressure inside your cooking vessel because it's sealed. So water boils, water vapor is formed. And because water vapor is formed, the pressure increases. And because pressure increases, further water cannot evaporate. Okay? That's why it increases the boiling point of water. So that's basically the principle. So inside a pressure cooker, water will boil only at 120, 121 Celsius at 1 bar above atmospheric pressure. That's the typical pressure inside. There are industrial pressure cookers that can go 2-3 bars for doing even more advanced industrial cooking, but at home it's usually 1 bar above atmospheric pressure, right? Then once that happens, because your temperature is now 121, your cooking happens much faster, right? So cooking happens, say, at 90 Celsius, much slower than cooking at, say, 120 Celsius. And because it happens faster, hey, you save on fuel, right? Because you're keeping the pressure in a sealed container, so you don't need to apply more heat and so on. So the valve, the whistle is essentially the sound that comes from the safety valve. The safety valve essentially is a hole at the top, on top of which a weight of a very specifically calibrated weight is put on top. The moment the pressure inside exceeds the weight, the force applied by the pressure inside exceeds the weight of what you put on top, it will push the weight up and the excess air will be let out. The pressure will be let out. So, the weight falls back down again. So that's essentially how it works. So the frequency with which the whistles come has to do with how much heat you're applying to the pressure cooker. It has nothing to do with the amount of the cooking process or how much cooking has happened. So if you put your pressure cooker on a very low heat, the whistles will take more time to come. If you put it on medium heat, the whistles will come at some sort of frequency. Put it on maximum heat, the whistles will come really, really fast. The general implied sense is that for pressure cooking, always put maximum heat because, that's when this heuristic works, right? So that is number one. Problem is that now if you're using induction stoves, this won't work at all. The induction stoves work almost 50-60% more efficiently in terms of heat transfer than your regular gas flame on a regular gas flame, right? So induction stoves will result in undercooked rice if you go by the 3 whistles route at top, at 2000 watts of power. you will get actually undercooked rice, right? So the better way, the more scientific way of doing this is to say that once you hear the first whistle, you turn down the heat to the absolute minimum, and then essentially uh, measure the amount of time. At this time, what's happening is you're measuring cook time at peak pressure. So pressure has been reached. Now you're measuring time, and you're not letting any second whistle come at all, right? So that's the entire idea. Uh, the funny thing is that every pressure cooker brand's manual will tell you this is how to do it. But hey, we don't read that. So we essentially just learn to do it through whistles, and that's what we'll do. And in some sense, think about it, right? So almost all middle class India had access to the same two burner stove, the same, two, three brands of cookers for most of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? Uh, and so in that context, the whistle method works for a nuclear family. So it doesn't work the moment you have a larger family. You need to apply more heat. You need to use a larger cooker, and it will simply break down, right? So the other interesting trick you could therefore use, now that you know that pressure cooking happens at 121, and you know that the Maillard reaction starts happening at 110 Celsius, you can actually do interesting things in the pressure cooker, like pressure caramelization, right? You can actually put carrot, beetroot, and things like that, or even onions, right? Key thing is don't add water, but just add a little bit of butter. So you just don't want the food to directly contact the hot metal, so you add the butter. But remember that all your vegetables, your carrot is 88% water. Beetroot is again probably 90% water, right? So there is enough water in it, so it won't burn in that sense, right? So as long as you add butter, now this is actually cooking at 121 Celsius. And once the exterior loses all of its moisture, it will start undergoing the Maillard reaction. And your carrot will actually become a darker brown. And trust me, you will not believe the amount of flavor that carrot actually has once you actually brown it, right? And the other thing is you put a ton of carrots with some butter and you do this, all you need to add is just salt. And trust me, you can get a caramelized carrot soup, one ingredient soup. I mean, literally just carrot and butter. That's all you need, right? And you won't need garlic. You won't need anything else. It's just so flavorful just by itself. You can do this with beetroot as well. So you can sort of extend what you can do with pressure cooking outside of just cooking rice and dal, right? Uh, and in general, unless you're cooking hard cuts of meat, I generally do say that uh, if you understand how proteins in meat work, they actually cook at about between 50 and 70 Celsius, all meat cooks. It's a huge problem. Vegetables actually cook at a higher temperature. Meat actually cooks at a lower temperature. But the prevailing wisdom is that meat is harder to cook. It's not. Vegetables take more energy and more this thing to cook than actually meat. That said, if you have tougher cuts of red meat and so on, it is quite common. Very, very fibrous, very, very sort of, shall we say, more connective tissue based sort of meat. Less fat, more muscle tissue based meat does do well with certain kinds of pressure cooking. But if you're doing fish and poultry and all that, please never pressure cook those things because you're going to overcook, guaranteed. Okay. So the other second bit of this thing that I commonly often encounter is that you have to knead atta to get a soft chapati, right? You don't. So if you think about how wheat works, so wheat has mostly starch and it has proteins called glutenin and gliadin, amongst other things. These are the two major ones. When they combine, they form this stretchy elastic thing, which is unique to wheat, right? You don't get that stretchy elastic thing with rice or besan or any other flour, right? Or corn or any of the other flours, but only with wheat, oats, and glutinous flours, so flours that have gluten, right? So this protein, essentially, once it becomes stretchy, it gives you an opportunity basically to say add more air bubbles inside so that this is it prevents air from going out so it can rise, and therefore you bake bread. So that's the origin of why we use wheat in most sense, right? Obviously, in the context of a chapati, leavening or adding air is not the concept, right? What a chapati has to somehow strike the balance between not being too chewy. If you try to make chapati with maida, it will turn out to be too chewy. The reason for that is that when atta is made, in India, we use a traditional method called a chakki mill, which is these two big stones that grind the atta. Why do we do that? Whereas everywhere else in the world, they use a different mechanism to powder the wheat. We use the chakki mill because it actually deliberately damages the gluten and some of the starches. So we deliberately damage it so that your chapati does not end up being too chewy. It does not having too much strong of a gluten structure, which is also why you can't use atta to make very good bread, but you can use it to make great chapatis and parathas because it's really designed only for that, right? So if you're making bread and you want some of the fiber in atta, please mix, 50-50 maida and atta and make it. Otherwise, you won't get great bread. Unless you're a spectacularly talented baker, it's very hard to do this. Okay. Uh, so in that context, what happens is when you add water to flour, the wheat proteins start essentially forming this elastic structure. They get hydrated and they kind of start forming this elastic structure. What happens is that all of the water loving parts face inside where there is more water, and all the water hating parts sort of face outside. That's how they get aligned. And when you knead, that's exactly what you're doing. You're working more water into the dough. So the gluten structure aligns itself so that all the water loving parts face inside and the water hating parts face outside, right? Now, the thing is that you don't need to knead. If you just let the dough sit for 30 minutes, it will knead itself. I mean, the water will simply cause the gluten structures to form itself. And you can save your shoulder a fair amount of work by letting it sit for 30 minutes. And then you do have to do very little kneading to get a really soft chapati. So this is number one, right? The other thing to remember is that in the context of doughs, in the context of Indian breads, right? Why do we add what we add? Right? Why do we add yogurt when we make parathas, right? And so on, right? We add yogurt when we make parathas because there is fat in yogurt. You could also add oil, right? So either of these, any kind of fat will make the dough softer. Why? Because fat actually prevents gluten structures from becoming too long. So when gluten structures are long, you get a chewy texture. When the gluten structures are short, you get a flaky texture. And we like the flakier, softer texture in the context of parathas and so on, right? More the water, the softer, etc. Up to a point. You can also add eggs and milk. It's not uncommon for naans and kulchas, especially in the northwest, especially you sort of step outside India and the Pakistan, Afghanistan region. The breads will also have egg as well in it. That also again adds extra protein. It also adds extra fat, which is very helpful in the context of creating a softer product. And eggs also create an airier product. So if you don't want to do yeast and all of that, so it also creates an airier product, right? Fat will give you a flakier. If you want a flakier this thing, you need to add. So your lacha paratha sort of thing involves a lot of oil or fat or butter or ghee being added into the dough, right? So that's essentially why it is. This one is about obviously the one that usually gets the most amount of attention. I sometimes get this attention even from like chefs who are like, oh, I've been marinating, I'm sure it makes a difference. And so here's the larger science to this, right? The common misconception is that marination adds flavor to meat. Okay, and we kind of spoke about the dal makhani one where we said flavors go inside the dal. It's the same thing here. Flavors do not penetrate meat. Only salt penetrates meat. What marination does is that it causes flavor, spice flavors and all of that to stick to the surface of the meat without falling off, so that when you cook it, it stays stuck. And therefore, when you eat it, you're actually just experiencing the flavors only at the top. But when you chew on it, you kind of get a sense that you're getting it everywhere, right? So marination adds flavor only to the surface of the meat. And if you don't believe me, there are some proper scientific experiments where they used a dye in a marinade to see after half an hour of marination, 2 days of marination, 1 week of marination, how far the marinade is actually penetrating into the meat. And they find that it barely penetrates above the surface of the meat. That is just how marination works, right? The intent of marination here is to get spices to stick to meat. How do you get spices to stick to meat? Is that one, we use an acid. So we either use yogurt, lime juice, or a combination of yogurt and lime juice, which is an acid. Acid will cook or denature the proteins on the surface. And because it's denaturing those proteins, it's easier for spices to stick because it creates more grooves and so on. The other thing is that by itself, many of these things will not stick. They need some kind of a medium in which they can be dissolved. That's why you have fat. So your marinade almost always must have some kind of fat. Good thing is that full cream yogurt has enough fat. Otherwise, people do often use mustard oil or ghee in the marinade. And that's an important thing because the fats will help these things stick to the surface of the denatured protein from the acid, right? And so on. So this is how marination works. If you actually want salt to get inside, you have to brine your meat. And there are great advantages to doing that. If you've always experienced that chicken tends to be really bone dry in India, that it tends to overcook. And the only place where you get truly soft, succulent chicken is when you get it out of a tandoor. because there it's not being overcooked. It's only being cooked in for 30 seconds or a minute, and it comes out just perfectly cooked, right? And without losing enough moisture. Part of the problem of cooking meat is that it will lose moisture, right? When you cook, what happens is that the tenderness of meat has to do with the fact that there is water in between muscle fibers. And when muscle fibers are cooked, the proteins denature, they squeeze out water. That water is lost, and now your meat will then taste really, really dry, right? So how do you keep the water inside the muscle fiber? Is by adding salt. Now, common sense, right? So when we go out exercising, when we go out on a run, etc., you feel dehydrated. Hot day, you feel dehydrated. What do? You literally take sugar because you need energy. You take salt. Salt is an important part. Why do we take the salt? Because the salt in our muscles will prevent further loss of water via perspiration, right? Because the salt actually helps water be retained in muscles. Otherwise, you get cramped, right? And that's exactly why we do exactly the same thing. So dipping it in salty water, 8% salty water for an hour or so, at least for chicken, right? Will get the salt into the muscle tissue, which then when you cook, no matter how long you cook, it's not likely to lose all the water and it will stay juicy, right? So if you ever brine your chicken, after which you can then marinate, you can do all those other things. Trust me, you'll never go back to not doing it. And you'll be wondering, why was I not doing it? But there's a funny story, right? Think about the word marination. The word marination actually literally means soak in seawater. Okay. For some reason, the word actually means that, but that's not what we do, right? The original term was that when, in Europe, they would literally take meat, wash it in seawater, and then use it. And apparently, it would soak it in seawater and then use it because it kept the meat juicy. And so people knew that. That's the origin of the term marination, but, that's not, we seem to have lost the meaning. So remember that, a lot of this, a classic example of why, if you don't know the actual why, you will lose a lot of knowledge. And that's why taking traditional wisdom, tacit wisdom, and explaining it with science is important for the preservation of traditional knowledge, if you really think about it that way, right? And so that's a marination, right? The other thing is that if you often see, you will find that South Indian cooking does not do marination at all of meat. Marination is more of a North Indian thing. So you marinate meat in yogurt and spices and so on. In the South, when meat is bought, it's smeared with turmeric, salt, chili powder, and kept, because it's a preservative. Salt is a preservative, turmeric is a preservative, chili powder is a preservative, right? And then after that, in the past, when you didn't have refrigeration, you had to do these things. And by the way, so therefore, dry brining, the application of salt on the meat will also work. Not as well as completely soaking it for 1 hour, but it still works. So for most part, brining is something that is not new. It's not like some techies have discovered this and now evangelizing it to everyone. People have been doing it in several parts of India. So sometimes you'll often find that if you just look outside your region and see how other people cook, you'll find that, oh, I'm doing this, and they don't seem to be doing this, but somehow we seem to get pretty much similar results. So maybe ask yourself, is this step really necessary, right? So I think that's also part of the process of optimizing and learning what works and why it works as we go forward, right? And and also people will say, I marinate for 2 days and 5 days. Makes no difference. You need half an hour for acids to denature protein and for your spices to stick to the surface. You can do that in half an hour. Doing that for 2 days and 3 days makes no difference. If anything, if you add too much lime juice, which is a very strong acid, very low pH, it will damage the texture of the meat and make it mealy the longer you marinate it. So in fact, you should not over marinate, right? So that is my talk, at least. So now maybe let's do a Q&A and enjoy your cooking.
So first, piece of advice to you. There must be only 118 myths you can explode in a 1 hour lecture. I think that in the last 45 minutes or an hour, you have really done. I mean, there are so many things which you have told us which we thought we always knew to be explicit knowledge. But you have told us that it is tacit knowledge, and then what we know is wrong. Really, it's amazing. When you said that, that we don't, Indian cooking is not recipe centric. There is a word which my grandmother used in her cookbook in Telugu. It says taginanta. Saginata in Tamil equivalent approximately Eta Madre, and
Yes.
approximately,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Andaz. Yeah. Yes.
Andaz.
Yes.
So, I mean, I read that word so many times, but and it never hit me that
Yeah.
this is what they mean. It's a fascinating exposition. I'm sure that our entire audience enjoyed it, and we have many, 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 many questions, and we will
Sure.
shoot the other. The first question Mr. Vyasumurthy has, Padmana, what are the things that should not be cooked together in a pressure cooker?
Yeah. So there's a specific a chapter in the book. I think the first chapter that kind of highlights why it's important to understand what cooks at what temperature. Right? So and then this varies between whether it's plant material, whether it is meat, and within meat there's a distinction between eggs and fish and poultry and red meat. Right. So there is a big variation here, right? And within plants, variation is quite large because depending on how much water, for instance. So a cucumber is 95% water, right? So it cooks much faster than a carrot or a potato, which has much less, and so on. So it takes more time, more starch, more time, and so on, right? So understanding what constitutes your ingredients, and also understanding when proteins tend to cook, when starches tend to cook, etc., uh, is how you can determine what you can cook together in a pressure cooker or anywhere, right? We intuitively know that if you put, say, beans or cabbage and potato and start cooking at the same time, by the time the potatoes cook, the beans are going to be mush, right? So we intuitively kind of know that. The same sort of principles apply. So in general, what I would say is that cooking vegetables and meat, particularly poultry and fish, together in a pressure cooker is going to overcook the meat. Definitely going to overcook the meat, right? So I think it's that you apply. So once you know this, then you kind of know that you can either time it. So in an open pot cooking, you can start the potato first. Then once the potato gets halfway there, then you add the beans. So you can intuitively do those things. But in a pressure cooker, unfortunately, everything has to cook at the same time, right? Which is part of my problem with this one pot, one shot thing. It's convenient, but you're going to end up with some ingredients overcooked and some undercooked, depending on how you do it. So pick ingredients that kind of roughly cook at the same rate for cooking together. So which is also why they say that when you're making like a khichdi, always soak the rice and dal ahead of time, because it actually then gives it a level playing field. Otherwise, the dal takes a little bit more time to cook than the rice. And so if you want the right texture, soak both. So that way, you get the right balanced texture when you actually pressure cook rice and dal together, right? And likewise, in some cases, you take a dish like, say, a bisi bele bath, right? The best bisi bele bath is not where you put rice, dal, vegetables, and pressure cook everything together, right? They will often steam the vegetables separately and then add them after the rice and dal are cooked, along with the spices. So you get a better texture. The vegetables still have some kind of texture to them, and so on. So that's how you think about what you cook. So generally, no, meat and vegetables to cook vegetables together. Avoid starches and softer vegetables. Greens, pressure cook. They tend to go bitter, so you might want to keep that in mind as well. Yes.
But when we cook pongal, we cook both the mung dal and the
Yeah,
rice.
moong dal is an exception because moong dal is cooks ridiculously fast. So chana dal, tur dal, all the other dals are hardier and take more time to cook. So moong dal is cooks at about the same rate as rice, so it works perfectly fine.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
That was fascinating, Ashok. Very
yeah,
nice.
thank you. Yeah.
Uh, what is the play of nutrition and taste in food? How does one deal with the other, and what kind of balance is required?
This is a really hard question. There are no easy. I think the only answer here is that there are no easy answers. Okay, don't look for simplistic sort of explanations, right? So on the one hand, you think about how our sense of taste has evolved, right? Uh, we evolved at a time when easy availability of carbohydrates and sugars was very minimal. Okay? Because it took agriculture for us to get cheap carbohydrates that you've colonized a piece of land, you're growing only rice, only grain, only wheat, and you get carbohydrates cheaply, is a breakthrough in humanity that resulted in population explosion. But for most of our humanity's history, but agriculture is only some 10,000, 8,000 years old. But for billions of years, as primates and as apes, we were short on carbohydrates, right? Which meant that it we had to evolve to make sure that we find a ripe fruit, you got to eat it. You got to love it, because if you don't eat it, you're not getting enough energy, right? So you want to make sure that you get all these, get yourself addicted to sugar in general. So that's why we have such a strong sweet tooth and we are addicted to sugar. And so, which is also uniquely why we live in times when sugar and carbohydrates are so cheap that our evolution is not fit for that, right? And now what has happened is that the rise of diabetes and all these other uh, uh, diet-related food problems of health come from the fact that we have not evolved to deal with so much cheap sugar. So it takes a tremendous amount of willpower to do that. So so the one factor you have to keep in mind is that there are natural evolutionary limitations. Another fascinating example of this is that we produce a ton of acid in our stomach, right? The amount of acid we produce in our stomach is related to obviously digesting denaturing proteins. Because for most of our evolution, we were eating largely meat and uncooked meat at that, which takes a lot more time to cook and digest. Literally, all the cooking happened inside your stomach. And so when you therefore eat very starchy foods, some vegetarian diets that are very, very high on starch, right? You're literally eating rice and potato and a bunch of other things and tubers, yams and so on. All of that's going to produce a huge amount of gas. So so you're going to have so that's why you need to balance that with a ton of fiber and things like that. So there are evolutionary disadvantages and there are variations between populations. There are, so for example, genetic variations between how sensitive you are to bitter tastes, right? Why do we have a bitter taste? It's primarily to prevent us from ingesting poisons, because poisons or alkaloids tend to be bitter, right? And yet some of the healthiest things that you can eat also taste bitter. So it's a very bizarre thing, right? So it's very hard to eat Karela. It's really good for you, but it's really hard. And depending on how sensitive you are to bitter tastes, and some part of the population is very sensitive to bitter tastes and some part of the population is not, right? For some people, broccoli is inedible. For some people, it's nice. For 14% of the population cannot tolerate coriander in its leaf form, because there's a specific molecule that gives you a very strong taste of soap, right? There's a specific aldehyde that actually gives the taste of soap. So people who cannot tolerate coriander is because it literally tastes of soap. But for people who don't sense that, it's perfectly fine. And the very same people who cannot tolerate coriander in its leaf form are okay with it in chutney form, because it's neutralized when you actually grind the entire coriander into a chutney, right? So then you don't get that soapy feeling that you get with raw coriander and so on. So likewise, I think the problem here is that the knowledge of nutrition has also continuously changed. So there are broadly two ways of thinking about it, right? One is to relentlessly try and keep in touch with what is the modern science, what is good for me, what is not good for me, right? Versus recognize the fact that most traditional diets in general have stood the test of time, in the sense that we've stayed alive for all this while, so this will probably be fine, right? So often, sometimes, just eating what your great grandmother ate is probably a sensible thing to do, than figure out whether one additive that is added to your food today is healthy or not, as much as possible. Again, so Michael Pollan's advice, that eat food, I mean food meaning that as much as possible, food is something that grows out of the earth, or is something that is a living thing that you can eat, not something that you open out of a packet. So that's his definition of food, right? Eat food, mostly plants, as much as possible plants, with whatever protein you need from animal sources, right? And then not too much, right? So again, this is, as far as I'm concerned, the only universal nutrition advice is this. And then don't worry about anything else, and just eat what your great grandmother ate, and you'll be fine. And last but not the least, when you have a specific problem, don't ask random people on the internet like me. Ask actual experts with a degree. So I think that is important, if you want to really understand when you have a problem and so on.
Actually, I should tell you what my great grandmother told me, and then there's a question on this. What is the stigma attached to root vegetables, onion and garlic, especially with the Jains and Vaishnavite Brahmin? We don't eat onion and garlic at home.
Yeah.
So what the problem is, and is there any nutritional thing, or is it only cultural, religious? What is it?
Yeah. So globally, I think, so in general, what you find, and this is not just true in India, but true in many parts of the world. Um, uh, so essentially, the privileged and rich in society tend to have the opportunity to use food as an identity marker. In that they have the privilege of being able to say that I'm defined by what I don't eat. Right? Because what happens is that when something is grown universally, everyone will have access to it. Like what distinguishes you is that you don't eat something. So there is that one element of that, and so you'll often find in many parts of the world that the rich tend to have more dietary restrictions than the poor, who literally have to eat whatever they can get, right, rather than be choosy about it. That's number one. The second thing is in the context of the subcontinent, and then in the context of Jainism, particularly, if you read a lot of the history, K.T. Acharya's book and others, right? You see that so obviously Jainism and Buddhism sort of were evolved at a time in contrast to very ritualized forms of Hindu faith that existed around India, that was heavy on sacrifices, heavy on animal sacrifices, heavy on meat consumption, right? So you read the Vedas. I mean, some of the Vedas are literally just instructions on how to slaughter a bull, how to slaughter this, how to what do you have to sacrifice to Indra, what do you have to sacrifice to Agni, and so on. So clearly, I think meat consumption, large scale, and sacrifices as a sense was huge, right? And in many ways, Jainism and this evolved as like alternatives, right? Saying I have a better product to sell. This is ahimsa. This is less this thing. And obviously, if you see the spectrum of how we follow those faiths, the extreme end is going to be to the point where I will not hurt as many living things as possible. And so that logically, if you take it to the extreme end, you will have Jain monks who will literally say that I can only eat fruits that have fallen from the tree, because the act of plucking a fruit is violence. So that's like one extreme, right? But obviously, some others will say, I'm okay with eating fruits. But and the one slightly less extreme with practical ones will say, fine, I'm okay eating anything above the ground, because any plant above the ground, I can pluck the fruit and not kill the plant. Root vegetables, I have to kill the plant. The entire plant has to be killed, and all the other insects and worms and other things that are along with the root have to be killed, right? So that's why the historical sort of problems with, say, root vegetables. And even there are variations. Ginger seems to be okay, but and turmeric seems to be okay, but not potatoes, but not other things as well, right? So again, the point here is that there are no easy ways of looking at this. It's just a spectrum of faiths that have evolved from a central idea that there should be more ahimsa and so on. But that's essentially, but followed to varying degrees. You will have Brahmin communities in Kashmir who will eat meat because you can't live in the mountains and be vegetarian. It's just you don't get food all through the year. So you will have to get your food from as many sources as possible. And in the winter, animals are going to be your only source of food for most part. And so what you will find is that food is a function of geography, historical context, climate, local availability, and it constantly changes. Trade changes it, invasions change it, colonialism changes it, the inventions of modern technology kinds of changes it. And we continuously change, continuously rationalize. My grandmother may not eat radish and garlic, right? My mother's okay with radish, not okay with garlic. But my generation eats anything and everything, right? So it's just that these are habits that will change over time. But that's the historical reason why root vegetables are not eaten. I did see that there was another question related to garlic as well as asafoetida, particularly, is quite interesting, right? Garlic and onion tend to have flavor molecules that come from sulfurous molecules, right? And sulfurous molecules are essentially also the family of molecules, sulfurous molecules, also are found in meat. So the aroma of meat and so on. So in some sense, I think the garlic and onion were seen as analogs to plant analogs to meat in that sense, and they are layered. And so the idea was that it was considered almost to be an animal in that sense, by at least historically and so on. The funny thing is that asafoetida became popular because it has a similar flavor profile. It has very similar sulfurous molecules, like onion and garlic, and is not onion and garlic. So again, in the sense, you find how people rationalize this, right? So on the one hand, your religion is telling you, your faith is telling you, you must not eat onion and garlic. And yet you're seeking out something else that has the exact same flavor, but happens to be from another plant, right? So that's just how I think our desire for good flavors almost always trumps religious restrictions against what you can or cannot eat, and continues to change over time. So asafoetida's popularity amongst Jains, amongst Brahmin communities in India, is because they've historically not had onion and garlic, and this is just a great replacement for it.
Oh, wow, that's a terrific answer.
Absolutely fabulous answer, Ashok.
What do you think about this cross-cultural food? This is a question specific in context of the board which we see in the US called We Serve Indian Chinese Food.
Mm.
You know, I mean, and you also mentioned the word authentic here.
Yeah.
So at what point in time do these cross-cultural foods become authentic?
That's what. So it's a question of your definition of authenticity, right? The uncharitable way of looking at authenticity is somebody deciding that what their nostalgia about food is the only kind of nostalgia others are allowed to enjoy, right? And I often give this example that Bombay serves Szechuan dosa. Okay, so you won't find it less likely to find it in Chennai, or more likely to find it in Bombay or Delhi. Right, so it's a classic sort of typical urban sort of fusion food, and it's quite popular, right? The reason it's on the menu, right? The market will tell you, right? You may be outraged that it's not authentic, but you can't beat the market, right? At the end of the day, it's on menus because clearly people are buying and they're enjoying it, right? And when you think about how people enjoy food, so it turns out that how we appreciate flavor has to do with a bunch of things. One is taste, obviously just the 5 tastes, and then the aromas. And the combination of all of this is stored in our brains in very complex sort of like multi-sensory images of flavor memories. And the part of the brain that deals with flavor is the same part of the brain that deals with nostalgia, right? Which is why food is very, very close to how we, very close to our heart in terms of how we, so we use expressions like it left a bitter aftertaste, right? For describing things unrelated to food. I'm unable to swallow this, for example, is another metaphor. So a lot of language of food is also very close to the language of emotions and how we process memories and so on, right? And so when you taste something familiar, your brain is literally saying, hey, I've tasted this before. This was the experience that you had, and now you're having it again, and it strengthens that entire thing. So the more you have something in a certain way, the stronger you build a nostalgia for that specific way of doing it. Right? So it's you're essentially, the more you eat the same thing, the narrower your taste become. That's literally, and your ability to be adventurous reduces. It's just the way it is, right? Yes, and that there's another aspect. There are some people who are naturally more adventurous, and many people are naturally conservative. And this is not surprising at all. Food is literally the only foreign object other than water that we put into our bodies, okay, every day. So it is quite, and literally that's the only thing that can kill you. Literally, right? So therefore, people historically have always been wary about what they eat, and be very particular about only eating things that are well tested, and it's their tradition. And as a conservatism in food, as an evolutionary trait, is useful in that, so you don't end up eating and hurting yourself, and causing any damage and so on, right? So when you think about this, so the person eating dosa in Chennai is literally going to have memories of having eaten it at home so many times for breakfast, right? And so the expectation that the dosa that he eats at a restaurant has to be a lot more closer to what he's having at home gets intensely and stronger and stronger and stronger. So the guy in Mumbai enjoying Szechuan dosa did not grow up eating dosa at home, for most part, right? He doesn't have those flavor memories. For him, this is a fantastic new flavor experience, right? And so he enjoys it, right? And it is ridiculous that people get upset that somebody is putting chocolate on dosa. Or so food has always evolved by constant experimentation. If we are worked up about Indo-Chinese cuisine, would we call sambar Tamil Maratha cuisine? Nobody seems to call it that, right? Literally, you take any dish in India, there will be no pure authentic dish. There are influences of colonialism, influences of all of the sort of external influences we had over the last 2,000 years, right? All the way from Alexander to the Mughals, to everyone else, has contributed to the cuisine of the subcontinent, right? The biryani is literally the combination of usage of local spicy, high spice dishes and the more minimalist way of making pulavs in Persia and in Central Asia, combine both, you get a biryani, right? And literally, so that's true of everything else. We've adopted the potato as it is, and that's true of Indo-Chinese cooking too, right? It is. You also have to see that there's a market nature of this. A lot of Chinese cooking is very restaurant friendly, in that it takes very little time to put together, and it uses pre-packaged ingredients like soy sauce and chili sauces, and it cooks at a very high temperature in a short amount of time, right? Uh, to make say a vegetable jalfrezi, it takes a lot more time. Okay, so you can understand why there's a market nature of why even a street side vendor, he would rather sell you chow mein than cook some traditional Indian dish, because it takes a lot more time to make it, right? So there are all these factors that go into what constitutes street food, what constitutes food, etc. I don't think authenticity should be the lens through which we view it at all. I would rather see if people like it. I think they like it, and that's just the way it is.
What is the essential difference between Indian cooking and non-Indian cooking? Because you have written about Indian cooking.
So there are many ways to think about it, but I think the simplest way to think about it is to sort of take a few other examples. And I will sort of frame these as, let's take Japanese cooking as one style, Chinese cooking as one, Southeast Asian and South Asian. I would combine Southeast Asian and South Asian. Although there are influences of Chinese cooking in Southeast Asian cooking, Vietnam, Thailand, and others, they are closer to Indian cooking styles than they are to Chinese cooking styles in that sense, right? At least to start with in this part of the world, right? And perhaps you can take Middle East as another sort of thing there, right? So one, styles of cooking also are impacted by how you eat and who you eat with. So there is no culture of communal eating in the sense of eating together, everybody eating around a tent, taking from the same plate. That's a very Middle Eastern thing, right? So the style of cooking and how you cook has evolved to essentially deal with that, right? So you go to Iran, you go to Israel, you go to Arabia or anywhere else, right? To Jordan or anywhere else. There's going to be these big dishes, tons of small condiments, right? And then everyone takes pieces from each one of them and then constructs their own meal in a communal way, right? While they dine with each other, right? That's so a lot of cooking styles also have to do with your social structures themselves. In India, cooking is a deeply personal thing done only at home and done fresh only. Okay, so our style of cooking has also evolved under that sort of milieu, which is that everything has to be done from scratch. We do not eat old food. And it has to be cooked from scratch, and it has to be cooked only at home and only to be eaten by only family members. So if you keep all of that in mind, so Indian cooking, I generally tend to describe it as fat and spices based. In other words, that the flavor profile of Indian cooking comes from what fat you choose to use and what spices you choose to use. The choice of oil and the choice of fats you add at the start define the flavor of the final dish, right? So if you start with ghee and you add cumin and cloves and other things, and you add ginger, garlic, tomatoes, you get a very Punjabi, North Indian kind of a feel. If you start with mustard oil, panchforan, etc., whatever you make after that will taste Bengali. If you start with coconut oil and add curry leaves and garlic and so on, it'll taste South Indian. And there are infinite variations based on what fat and what combinations, what you use, what you don't use. The use of fennel makes it very chettinad as well. And again, but likewise, the use of dry ginger and fennel also makes it Kashmiri on the other end of the spectrum. But at the end of the day, it is still the choice of fat and the choice of spices that literally defines the flavor profile of most dishes in the Indian subcontinent. So it's a fat and spices based this thing. And it's very similar, by the way, in Southeast Asia. Again, fat, there's a choice of fat. The spices, rather than dry spices, they use pastes. That's the only distinction, in that sense, of Thai or Vietnamese cooking and so on, right? But as you kind of get towards, say, Japan on the other extreme, that's an umami-centric cuisine. So umami-centric cuisine essentially is that their cuisine is not about blooming spices and fat. Their cuisine is centered around creating a flavorful broth. How you create a flavorful broth is by getting tons of glutamates into and flavor molecules into water. That's their primary thing. So many dishes in Japan will start with first making a stock. A stock is made from typically seaweed and the use of, say, small fish and so on. So you create a very umami heavy broth. And then, then you can add other things, vegetables and other things. So it becomes that's your base. You can add noodles to that, and so on. So umami centric is why the term umami itself is a Japanese term. And you see Chinese again is their style of cooking has sort of evolved from using a huge diversity of ingredients cooked in a very short amount of time for most part. Again, because of fuel shortages and so on in the past, a lot of their cooking is in a wok. It's very fast. It's very rapid. And the vegetables and the stuff maintain a bit of their crunch and so on. And a lot of the other cooking. So I would say that's like high speed, wok driven sort of cooking. And again, this is probably a simplification because China is as large, if not larger, and has more diversity of culinary styles within China itself. And I'm probably oversimplifying, but I'm talking about the general, what is the externally visible forms of Chinese cooking. You go deep inside China, you get tons of variations. There are very sophisticated, long fermented dishes and so on. But two things that stand out: high temperature wok-based cooking and the use of an insane diversity of ingredients. Nobody uses more kinds of protein than the Chinese do, right? So in that sense, I think this is what I would say are the broader distinctions in these different styles of cooking.
Okay, there's a political question. What is your take on America banning MSG as a way of culinary politics, or was it really bad for health?
So the original history of MSG becoming a bad thing was essentially just simple racism. There was no science to it. That was, it was one random guy basically said that he kept getting headaches, when he ate at Chinese restaurants, and it began to be called Chinese restaurant syndrome and so on. And there was very poor science in terms of nobody really just did anything else after that, right? So that's the original basis for the fears of MSG that we have kind of worldwide. It goes back to fundamentally just simple racism, right? While recognizing that there are two aspects to this. One is that glutamates, of which MSG is simply its pure form, okay? The sodium salt of glutamic acid, is everywhere. Okay, it's in tomatoes, it's in Parmesan cheese, it's in so many, it's in fish, it's in most meat that you eat and so on. Glutamates are everywhere, right? And the more concentrated, seaweed has tons of it. The more concentrated it is, the stronger the sense of it. And this is simply the absolute, concentrated version of that, right? And because it's also a sodium salt of that, it also tastes salty, right? So it's not sodium chloride that is salty. All sodium salts tend to be salty to varying degrees. Sodium chloride is just the saltiest. Okay. So what happens is that there is, however, in high enough concentration, it may not be good for you, right? And they've done these tests on mice and all that, right? Come on, you know how we experiment. It's like they literally feed the mice only MSG for like sustained periods of time, and they'll find that it dies. But the argument could be made that literally everything is bad for you in high enough quantities. So, and typically in an average this thing, in a special occasion, you're using like a quarter teaspoon. You should really not be using more than that. There is really just no harm at all. So there is no evidence of that harm. There are some people who. There are people who have gluten allergies. There are people who have peanut allergies. There are people who have MSG allergies, like that. So if you have that allergy, by all means, and probably don't overuse it. 3 times a day, every day may not be a good idea. So there is. So I don't want to sound like someone who says that you use it every time, use it every day, use large amounts of it. No, use small amounts. Use it sparingly. Use it once in a while on special occasions. It's perfectly fine.
What is your favorite cuisine? Do you have
my
one?
favorite cuisine? Yes. So my favorite cuisine is Mexican food. It used to be Thai food, and then it became Mexican food. I actually sometimes actively prefer it to Indian food, or even my comfort food that I grew up with, and so on, because I really think it's one. Their cuisine has this sort of fantastic mix of fresh ingredients and cooked ingredients. Whereas I find that I think sometimes in Indian cooking, we're not, for example, we're not known for salads, right? We want to cook everything, and it's understandable. Climate, no refrigeration and so on, and risk of infections and all that is fine. But I think it's also time. I would actually hope that inventive chefs actually make more interesting Indianized salads as we go forward, now that we have refrigeration. So we have to modernize that. But yes, Mexican food, the mix interplay between fresh and cooked ingredients, right? And in multiple ways. It's not just about salad versus, say, cooked ingredients, right? The sauces, the sauces themselves, the salsas, can be both cooked as well as uncooked. So you can make a salsa from raw, chilies, tomato, and others. But you can also make it from roasted chilies and tomatoes, and it has a very different flavor profile. Uh, and their ability to use also every part of the animal from a wastage standpoint. They don't waste anything, right? Uh, Typically, what you often find is that in the context of India, the poor will eat any part of the animal. The rich will eat only very choice parts of the animal, right? The rich will eat only some of the larger fish. The poor will eat the smaller fish, which are actually tastier and more healthy and all that. But in Mexico, they've turned the ability to cook every part of the animal into an absolute art form, to the point where even the rich will eat literally every part of the animal. So in that sense, and also I think I think my favorite part of Mexican cuisine probably has to be the fact that they have like 200 varieties of chilies. Okay. In India, we believe that chilies are like, hey, our cuisine is centered around chilies. We don't have very great chilies at all. You leave aside the Bhut Jolokia and maybe a few varieties from Guntur and others. Our chilies are just heat, not flavor. Okay. Not as much flavor. There are a few here and there, but they're mostly just heat, right? Or they just color, like the Kashmiri, Bedige chilies in Karnataka and so on. But your Mexico has 200 varieties of chilies, and that's where chilies come from, right? So that's a spiritual home of chilies. Originated in Mexico and then went to the world, around the world in the 16th century and so on. They have chilies that give you every possible flavor. There are chilies which have a fruity yet hot flavor. There are chilies that have a lemony flavor. There are chilies that have a smoky flavor. There are chilies that have every possible range of flavor. And by the way, there are some recipes that will call specifically for the use of 3 different varieties of chili to get a specific flavor. So what in India would be, we will use ginger, garlic, onion, tomato, chilies. They will use 5 varieties of chilies to get a very similar rich flavor. And they would not use anything else.
Wow.
And it is, so I find, so the range, and again, from very hot, and if people think Indian food is hot, you haven't had really hot Mexican food. It is blazing hot, right? So, people from Andhra, I think, if you think you have hot food, try eating some of the salsas in Mexico City, and you will realize you got nothing on that. Some of those chilies there are 100 times hotter than the chilies that you get here and so on. And I think some of the different variations, and the fact that if you go south of Mexico, the use of corn, the use of really more sophisticated spices, the mole sauce and all of that is just fantastic. So my favorite cuisine is Mexican. I haven't obviously traveled there for a while now, but I absolutely love it.
Someone here is asking me one simple question. What makes the market dahi different from the home dahi?
Yeah. So essentially what happens with industrial dahi is that, you have to remember that yogurt is actually a living thing. Okay. So not to sound macabre, but it is milk fermented by lactobacteria, and the fermentation continues. Okay. So even if you put it in the fridge, the fermentation doesn't stop. It just slows down. So which is why with enough time, the dahi will not be usable, right? So because it's still fermenting, the bacteria are still reproducing, they're still eating the sugars in the milk and so on, right? So what happens, at least with industrial dahi, is the 2 things. One is that home dahi will have a greater diversity of bacteria, which is why dahi in every home will taste different, because the family of bacteria that you happen to have either in your home, in your air, or in the previous batch of dahi that you used to make the new one, it will vary. So this population mix will vary, and so the flavor will ultimately vary, right? And so every house has a different sort of taste and so on. Obviously, industrially, I think you'll have to standardize, and so you really you want to use just a few narrow, specific, industrially produced, genetically modified species that are just ideal in terms of the fermentation rate and consistent taste and so on. So there is that. So industrial dahi tends to taste largely uniform, but perhaps doesn't have the diversity of taste that you have. The second thing is that there is also a vested interest for food companies that the fermentation should stop after the product is shipped out, right? It should not continue to ferment more. I want it to be exact at that thickness and still stay there, because otherwise the customer will not buy if he finds a pool of water gathering above as the fermentation continues, right?
Yeah.
So they obviously make sure that after it's produced, it's reached that fermentation stage, all the bacteria are killed. So there are typically no live cultures anymore in that yogurt. And so it just has that flat taste as of that level. Whereas your home dahi will change taste every day. It'll keep getting sour, So it's really, that's the fundamental difference between home and what you buy.
No, there's a question here actually, the category of tips. One is, why do you add a little bit of salt to paisam? Second thing is, could you say something about fermented foods like idli and khichdi?
Oh yes.
Kimchi, South Korea.
Okay, absolutely. So salt in payasam actually is similar to how I think. So in savory dishes, adding a little bit of sugar enhances the flavor, and sweet dishes adding a little bit of salt enhances the flavor, because salt and sweet are things that actually amp up, because we're so strongly addicted to them, because our body needs sodium and our body needs sugar. So the moment we sense that, it actually amplifies, it makes us a heightened sense of experience when you actually eat something. So a tiny pinch of salt in a kheer will actually just make you appreciate the sweetness a lot more, right? And also there's this other interesting aspect. There's a Bengali dish called shukto, right? Which is a stew made with many vegetables. It's a very mildly spiced dish. It's not a intense sort of dish. It also has bitter gourd. And the fascinating aspect is that it also uses, like, say, sweet potato and things like that. So the moment you bite into the bitter gourd, you experience a bit of that bitterness, and then you bite into the sweet potato. The sweet potato tastes better because you've just experienced bitterness, and now this. So there's a lot of good food is about creating those balances. And so likewise, I think a pinch of salt in that's why there's a famous ice cream flavor called sea salt and caramel, right? So it's ice cream. There's caramel, which is exceedingly sweet, and then there's salt on top of it. So you experience the salt, and then the caramel actually tastes even better with the salt, because otherwise it would just taste one-dimensionally sweet. So that's that. So on fermentation, it is, see, I think, urban India seems to have sort of largely lost this habit, because we now use refrigeration. And so, but historically, fermentation is how we preserve things. We used to lacto ferment everything, but we don't now, right? So dishes like idli, dokla, and others are classic examples of using fermentation to not only improve um, the taste and flavor, which it does, right? Because fermentation produces a lot more umami compounds, a lot more flavor than just the raw ingredients themselves. See, fermentation is outsourcing the cooking process to bacteria before you eat it. So that's basically what it is. Okay. The other thing is that you have it also improves the nutritive qualities of the food. So you get a lot more vitamin B, you get a lot more vitamin C. So kimchi and sauerkraut, for example, have 100, sometimes even 1,000 times more vitamin C than eating a lemon. Okay. So the general historical story that used to sailors used to carry lemons in ships to prevent vitamin C scurvy and all of that. Not so much lemons. Lemons will spoil. They used to carry sauerkraut, which is this fermented German equivalent of kimchi without all the spices, right? Fermented cabbage has 100 times more vitamin C, and it lasts forever because it continues to ferment, right? And so fermentation is, again, a way by which you are carefully selecting some bacteria to convert sugars in your food into lactic acid in the case of lactobacteria, and yeast will convert it to alcohol, right? So if you're making beer and wine, it's yeast. If you're making kimchi, idli, and all of that, it's lactobacteria, right? And it's not just kimchi or idli. You can ferment anything. You can ferment carrots. You can ferment beetroot. Just dump it in water with 2% salt or 2 to 3% salt. Completely immerse it because it has to be anaerobic conditions. And then in anywhere between 2 days and 3 weeks, if chilies will take a lot more time, but you can lacto ferment literally anything. And that will taste better. Amla is a fantastic example. Raw amla is very hard to eat. Lacto fermented amla is just amazing. It's just, just let it ferment. It takes a lot more time. You can just drop the whole amla in salt water, and then it's it. It's quite common in India for it to lacto ferment for a while. And it's just soft, much more sophisticated flavor. A lot of the bitterness goes away from the amla. A lot of the sourness is also muted because the original sourness is replaced with the more milder sourness of lactic acid, which is what the bacteria produce, and so on. So that's the background of fermentation.
I'll end this with one question, Ashok. And this question has been asked by 3 people. Could you shed some light on the ambivalence of milk-fish combination in Indian cuisine? North Indians hold it a no-no, whereas Bengalis and some South Indians cooking have always used it.
Yeah. So many of these food combination taboos, unfortunately, right? And because we often do not have written records for many things related to these kinds of things, particularly. That sometimes we don't know what reason the taboo originated. In some cases, we can make good, intelligent guesses, but in some cases, like milk and fish, I don't particularly know why some parts of India do not combine it. I mean, that said, it's also safe to say that it's possible that the fish that you're talking about in the context of North India is going to be, because there's no sea, it's going to be sort of more of a sea freshwater fish, right? Whereas they're talking about Bengal, Tamil Nadu, Orissa, Andhra, and all of that is going to be sea fish for most part. Not much freshwater fish is consumed here. So I don't know if there is a difference, but honestly, so the answer is I don't know. So, but we can find out why that specifically originated and see whether there was any reasoning at that point of time. But if you just ask for the science, there is no impact. There's tons of dishes where the use of any kind of milk product. I mean, at the end of the day, we do use butter to cook fish, and butter has a fair amount of milk solid still there, right? So it's not like ghee, which is just mostly just the fat. Butter has milk solids in it. So I don't think there's should be. I do use cream as well, which is also just high fat, right? 25-30% fat, right? So